Every year, the IMF lends billions of dollars to struggling governments around the world. Every year, citizens in those countries take to the streets to protest the terms. Greece saw some of the worst riots in modern European history after the IMF arrived in 2010. Argentina has signed 23 IMF programs since 1958, totaling $177 billion, and remains trapped in recurring crises. Ghana negotiated an IMF bailout in 2023, while families rationed electricity and food prices surged. Pakistan signed its 12th IMF program in 2024, with domestic inflation having peaked above 36% the previous year. The IMF describes each of these interventions as a rescue, but the people receiving that rescue rarely agree. Understanding why requires going back to a single hotel in New Hampshire in the summer of 1944. The Bretton Woods Conference gathered 44 Allied nations at the Mount Washington Hotel in July 1944, while World War II was still being fought. Delegates came to redesign the global financial system before the war had even ended. Two lead architects shaped the outcome: John Maynard Keynes for Britain and Harry Dexter White for the United States. Keynes proposed a symmetric institution, one that would discipline surplus countries just as much as deficit ones. Under the Keynes plan, any nation hoarding trade surpluses would face automatic financial penalties. Harry Dexter White rejected that framework because the United States was the world's largest creditor nation. The institution born at Bretton Woods reflected American priorities, not Keynesian balance. The original IMF mandate covered three goals: promoting monetary cooperation, stabilizing exchange rates, and lending to countries with balance of payments deficits. From the very beginning, the United States held a dominant quota, roughly a third of total votes at founding. The American veto at the IMF works through a specific mechanism that rarely gets explained. Every major IMF decision requires a supermajority of 85% of total voting power to pass. The United States currently holds 16.5% of total votes, precisely enough to block any major change single-handedly. China represents approximately 18% of global GDP, but holds just 6.4% of IMF voting shares. Emerging markets and developing economies as a whole represent 60% of global GDP, but hold only 40% of IMF votes. That structural gap between economic weight and institutional power explains why IMF governance has become one of the central debates in international finance. No major IMF reform has ever passed without American consent, and under the current rules, none can. When a country runs out of money to pay its debts, the IMF arrives with a loan package. The loan comes with a list of conditions, specific economic policy changes the government must implement to receive and retain funding. These conditions typically include cutting public spending, raising interest rates, privatizing state companies, and eliminating price controls. The theoretical logic is straightforward. Austerity reduces deficits, which restores investor confidence, which stabilizes the currency. IMF economists call this package structural adjustment, and the fund has applied versions of it for decades across every continent. The ideology behind structural adjustment has a name: the Washington Consensus. Economist John Williamson coined that term in 1989 to describe the overlapping policy framework shared by the IMF, World Bank, and U.S. Treasury. Washington Consensus priorities include trade liberalization, deregulation, privatization, and strict fiscal discipline. Critics from across the political spectrum, including many mainstream economists, argue that the Washington Consensus treats a specific ideological choice as if it were universal economic science. Cambridge University researchers examined over 55,000 individual conditions across 131 countries between 1985 and 2014, and found structural adjustment conditions increased by 61% between 2008 and 2014, returning to pre-crisis levels despite years of IMF reform announcements. Greece in 2010 became the most visible test case for IMF conditionality inside a modern democracy. Greece received a €110 billion bailout, jointly arranged by the IMF and the European Union. Conditions attached to that bailout required deep pension cuts, large-scale public sector layoffs, and sharp increases in consumption taxes. Greek GDP shrank by approximately 25% between 2008 and 2013, one of the deepest peacetime economic contractions in modern European history. By 2014, only around 20% of Greek debt remained in private hands. The rest was owed to official creditors, the EU, the ECB, and the IMF. Private bondholders who had lent to Greece during the boom years absorbed losses only after a multi-year delay, during which IMF and EU loans had covered their payments in full. Greece's debt-to-GDP ratio actually increased during the bailout years, not decreased. The IMF later acknowledged in its own review that growth forecasts for Greece were deeply flawed, and that austerity had a far larger contractionary effect than economic models had predicted. Argentina tells a longer and more instructive version of the same story. Since 1958, Argentina has signed 23 IMF programs totaling $177 billion in committed funds, the largest accumulation of IMF financing in global history. The 2001 Argentine crisis ended in the largest sovereign debt default in history at that time, following years of IMF-backed austerity and currency pegging. A $57 billion IMF loan in 2018, the largest single program in IMF history, still could not prevent Argentina from defaulting again in 2019. IMF investigators later found that the 2018 Argentine loan had been issued in breach of the fund's own exceptional access rules, without requiring debt restructuring first. Each Argentine bailout protected external private creditors and transferred the cost of adjustment onto Argentine workers, pensioners, and low-income households. Ghana entered IMF negotiations in 2022 after a debt crisis triggered by pandemic spending, rising commodity prices, and currency depreciation. The 2023 IMF program for Ghana required eliminating energy subsidies, restructuring domestic debt, and tightening fiscal policy across government spending. Ghanaian households already facing food price inflation absorbed additional cost increases when fuel and electricity subsidies were removed. Pakistan signed a new IMF arrangement in 2024, requiring central bank independence, a flexible exchange rate, and significant public spending cuts. Pakistani consumer prices had peaked above 36% year-on-year in 2023, before IMF conditions added further fiscal pressure. The conditions across Ghana, Pakistan, Greece, and Argentina are strikingly similar, regardless of local economic context, institutional capacity, or cause of the original crisis. The question then becomes, if the outcomes are so consistently harsh, why do governments keep accepting IMF programs? The answer lies in what economists call the lender of last resort problem. When private capital markets lose confidence in a government, no private bank will extend credit at any manageable interest rate. The IMF is often the only institution willing to lend at all, which makes conditionality a take-it-or-leave-it offer for a government-facing default. Signing an IMF program also functions as a signal to private markets. It tells bondholders that the government will prioritize debt repayment above domestic social spending. That signal is precisely the structural purpose. IMF conditionality restores creditor confidence, not citizen welfare. The IMF charged enough in interest across loans to Greece, Pakistan, Jamaica, Ireland, and Portugal to generate $3.1 billion in a single year. Profit made while those governments were implementing austerity. Two countries chose a radically different path, and both avoided the worst outcomes. Malaysia faced the full force of the 1997 Asian financial crisis, currency collapse, capital flight, and a crashing stock market. Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad publicly refused IMF assistance and imposed capital controls in September 1998, a decision the IMF loudly opposed at the time. Malaysia pegged the ringgit, restricted short-term capital outflows, and launched a domestic fiscal stimulus program. Harvard Kennedy School researchers later confirmed that Malaysian policies produced faster economic recovery, smaller declines in employment and real wages, and a more rapid stock market turnaround than any comparable country that accepted IMF programs. Iceland faced a different crisis in 2008, the collapse of a banking system that had grown to roughly 10 times the country's GDP. Iceland let its banks fail, allowed the krona to depreciate sharply by around 50%, and protected domestic depositors while repudiating foreign creditors. Employment in Iceland fell roughly half as much as in Ireland, which accepted a full IMF-EU austerity program and kept the euro. Iceland's nominal income recovered to boom-era levels by early 2011, years ahead of Ireland. The IMF has not stood still. The institution has repeatedly announced reforms and adjustments to conditionality. Official IMF language now endorses progressive taxation, cautions against excessive inequality, and includes social spending floor targets in some programs. But the Cambridge University research showed that nearly half of social spending conditions in African IMF programs were never implemented, while fiscal deficit targets were enforced almost without exception. The core priority of IMF lending, restoring market access and protecting creditor claims, has remained consistent across reform cycles, management changes, and decades of shifting economic orthodoxy. Who benefits most clearly from an IMF rescue is not a difficult question to answer empirically. Bondholders and institutional creditors receive full payment. Domestic populations absorb the adjustment cost. The fundamental problem with the IMF is not institutional malice. The fundamental problem is that an institution with a built-in American veto, staffed largely by economists trained in the Washington Consensus tradition and structurally accountable to creditor nations, will reliably produce policies that serve creditor interests. That is not failure. That is the system operating exactly as its founding architecture intended. Understanding that distinction separates a story about a broken rescue institution from the more accurate story, a debt collection mechanism with a very effective humanitarian branding strategy. The next time a country signs an IMF program, follow the money after the signing ceremony. And watch who gets paid first. Has the country where you live ever been through an IMF program? Leave a comment below. Describe what the impact actually looked like from the street level, because those accounts never appear in the official IMF reports. If World Stages helps you understand how global economic systems actually work, subscribe and share this video with someone who still believes the IMF is simply a neutral rescue institution.